Hearing that Joe Biden has chosen his nominee as vice president, and it is California Senator Kamala Harris, a woman who herself had run for the presidency, had her own campaign, of course. This is a woman who has been a senator for California in her first term. Let me read you this from Joe Biden. This just coming out. I have the great honor to announce that I have picked Kamala Harris, a fearless fighter for the little guy and one who has been there for them ever since the beginning. So we know Joe Biden had talked about choosing a woman. We did expect it would be a woman of color. Kamala Harris, whose mother is Indian and whose father is originally from Jamaica, has been chosen. A woman who made her career, of course, as a prosecutor in California in a number of capacities, first as a district attorney and then as the top prosecutor for the state of California as well. She also received a lot of attention and kudos for some during the nomination process of Donald Trump's second Supreme Court pick, Brett Kavanaugh, and the way that Kamala Harris questioned Brett Kavanaugh as well in terms of his role as a Supreme Court justice. Kamala Harris, as I mentioned, ran her own presidential campaign. There was a lot of promise in that campaign, but it did sputter out in October, November, just an issue with fundraising, as she was one of the top contenders. People had talked a lot about her as being the one who would be chosen. We did not know. And of course, Joe Biden making this announcement just a few days before the Democratic National Convention gets underway in a very different format, of course, because of the pandemic. We have got John Micek joining us from Pennsylvania with his immediate reaction to this. Senator Kamala Harris, what do you think, John?
Be first shall be last, Todd. Kamala Harris's name was one of the first to bubble up as a potential running mate for Joe Biden. She survived many weeks of speculation, a diverse field of very qualified candidates, but emerging at the end as Joe Biden's running mate. It's a intuitive pick. We know that the vice president and Senator Harris are, in his words, simpatico. She brings a great deal of intellectual firepower to the table, along her history of service in the Senate. And so here we find ourselves.
And, some have called her, the highest profile, woman of color in U.S. politics these days.
That is certainly true. It's hard to think of anyone in contemporary American politics right now who commands sort of the reputation and space in the headlines as Kamala Harris. As I'm sitting here talking to you, I have another screen up a little bit to my left, watching the scroll on this as the reaction comes in. This is a choice now that's kind of set the political world alight. Again, not entirely unexpected, but one that certainly is being talked about and one that will be parsed for the next couple of days.
Yeah, 55 years old and a woman who, as we were talking about, often called the top cop or a prosecutor. I'm curious what you think this will bring to the ticket here and sort of the immediate reaction. Imagine for young people of color who, of course, lived through Barack Obama's presidency, now see the current occupant of the White House, and now see Joe Biden nominate this woman.
Todd, we knew from the beginning that it was going to be a woman of color. That was something that the former vice president had made clear early on. You look for a lot of different things when you're recruiting a vice presidential candidate. You want a loyal second in command. You want somebody who's going to go out there and be a battler for you. You want somebody who brings a great deal of heft and intellectual firepower to the table. And certainly Kamala Harris ticks all three of those boxes. In your lead into the beginning of this segment, you mentioned her cross-examination of now Justice Brett M. Kavanaugh in Senate Judiciary Committee a year or so back, where she really made a national reputation and grilled him quite thoroughly. That's her background as a prosecutor right there. We know that she'll have some questions to answer, obviously, about her tenure as California's Attorney General, but she comes to the table as a four-square progressive Democrat on a lot of other scores. So certainly that will satisfy some segments of the base. So this is probably the best pick that Biden could have made across the board.
Yeah, you mentioned her record as a prosecutor in California. That's something that's been a bit tricky for her to navigate, certainly in her own presidential campaign, where some on the progressive left within her own party felt that she was too tough, John, and that she did not go after the police department as much as she should, and that she didn't stand up for communities of color as much as they had hoped she would when she was a prosecutor in California.
Yeah, and she's going to have to, in this incredible moment that we're in, Todd, right now, with people marching for racial justice, with people marching for police reform. That's something I think that Kamala Harris is going to have to explain to not only but to the progressive base, but to American voters over these next several days as we move into convention weekend, as we move into the fall campaign uh, proper. Uh, the way America has thought about law enforcement, the way it's thought about incarceration has undergone a sea change in the last 10 years. And certainly Senator Harris is going to have to explain to voters, she's going to have to explain to the base how she will be a voice for reform and how she'll be a voice for change within that arena.
The other thing I'm curious about is, people have talked about Joe Biden, his age, the idea of whether he would serve a second term if he gets to that point, and whether the vice presidential choice in this particular case with this nominee, Joe Biden, takes on an even more important role.
You hate to be grim reaperish about it, but Vice President Biden will be 78 years old if he wins and takes the oath of office next January 20th, making him the oldest, I believe, president ever to be sworn into office. He's described himself as a transitional president, a transitional candidate. And certainly that is something you have to think about. Senator Harris at 55 is young by any objective measure, quite active, quite vigorous. And could step in if the occasion calls for it. It's not as often, Todd, that vice presidents succeed their bosses, unless of course there is something tragic happens, as was the case with Lyndon Johnson in 1963 with the assassination of President Kennedy. So while it may not be a baton passing in 2024 to Kamala Harris, she will certainly be well positioned to run at that time if that is something she chooses to do.
The other thing that's interesting is some of the viewers here in Canada as well will remember, John, that during one of the primary debates, Kamala Harris went after Joe Biden, over busing in the U.S. and talked about her own personal experience growing up and as a young girl of color and what that was like. And she basically called him out. And this led to this whole story swirling in the last couple of months that, there was some bad blood on the Biden side of things from some of his advisors who felt that she had not, quote, apologized. And she was said to have said, hey, listen, that's politics.
Look, Joe Biden's been in public life for 50 years. It wasn't his first trip to the woodshed by any measure, but it certainly was a very public and very high-profile one from Senator Harris, who spoke with a real authenticity, I think, Todd, and a real authority about the uniqueness of her experience growing up as a multiracial child in California and going through busing. I'm old enough to remember busing experiments in my home state of Connecticut in like the late 1970s and the early 80s. Where students of color from Hartford, Connecticut, the state capital, were brought in. So that is something that exists within living memory for people of my generation and of Senator Harris's generation. And of course, that is something that she can speak to with authenticity. And it's not something that she probably apologized and she probably made as nice as she could. But when you are in the heat of a debate, everyone's a grown up. Everyone recognizes that the gloves are going to come off and punches are going to land. And that's just the way of it.
There's an interesting Canadian connection, too, that I always think is fascinating about Kamala Harris. In fact, her mother was a university professor, John. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but at one point, her mother was transferred to Montreal. And Kamala Harris spent part of her formative years, I think it was sort of her early teenage years, living in Montreal and growing up there for a period of maybe 5 or 6 years while her mother was a professor at McGill University. So there's sort of that interesting Canadian connection as well to this nominee. What do you think she brings to the ticket?
Well, just to sort of think about that point for a moment, sort of given the acrimony between our two governments over these last 3 years over matters of trade, putting it mildly, having somebody who's fluent in Canadian culture, who understands the needs and wants of your country and those cross-border concerns, certainly can't hurt. Again, I come back to it. She's a fantastic candidate on a lot of levels, and it's a very savvy choice, and admittedly had to have been a difficult pick for the Biden campaign with so many fantastic and talented women who were in the hunt right up until the last moment.
You know, I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to U.S. politics. The last couple of days, I've been reading about Geraldine Ferraro, who was, of course, Walter Mondale's choice way back in 1984, the very first woman ever to be on a major ticket as the vice presidential nominee. And, of course, Mondale and Ferraro were just decimated during Reagan's re-election in '84. But I'm just curious to get your take on what you think this woman, Senator Kamala Harris, is now going to face. Because Geraldine Ferraro faced a lot of sexism and misogyny back in 1984. We'd love to think things have changed. In some ways they have, but John, in a lot of ways they have not. What sort of blowback do you think she's now going to get from the Trump campaign?
Well, if Geraldine Ferraro was a product of 1984, Todd, Donald Trump is a product of 1954. We're going to be going into probably one of the dirtiest and most brutal general election cycles in memory. And, I thought it couldn't get worse than it was in 2016. I have a feeling that a cornered and wounded Donald Trump in 2020 will lash out. We have seen, because of the Black Lives Matter protests, because of the anti-racism protests, some of those tensions exacerbated with some sectors, I'm not saying all, but some sectors of the American right. I can see the president coming out hard against her on Twitter. I shudder to think what sort of denigrating nickname he might come up with for Senator Harris, because certainly that's something he's going to try. But Todd, I think we're also, in general, in a very different moment in American politics than we were in 1984. The country has come such an awful long way in terms of race relations, in terms of how it views women in government. There's universal agreement that a gender that comprises 51% of the population is dramatically underrepresented in our politics, and everyone wants to see that balance, and everyone wants to see that side of the ledger change. So in some ways, while President Trump will be waging this really bitter and divisive campaign, I think in a lot of ways he'll be swimming against the tides of history as well.
John, always good to have you with us, and thanks for taking the time to get on the show so quickly as this news broke.